most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither accept nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to accept it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet, mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream, but tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly and without comment a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than barricades. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted, in this manner, for several years, during which my general temperament and character had experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. My disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of the eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pinned the damnable atrocity. Then, one morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its neck, and hung it to the limb of a tree. The night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforth to despair. One night, as I sat, half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. I continued to caress it, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caress. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, it was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of a former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but, by slow degrees, it had, at length, assumed a rigorous distinctiveness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shuddered to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a nasty thing, of the gallows, oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. Beneath the pressure of torments, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my unusual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most unusual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting, in my wrath, the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by this interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe into her brain. She fell dead upon the spot. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here, at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into my house, I soundly and tranquilly slept, slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded to again make rigorous investigation of the premises. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee in my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word by way of triumph, and to render sure of their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, "I delight to have allayed your suspicion. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily, with a cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence, and I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream. Utterly animalious and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party remained motionless through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectator. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.